Good morning. My name is Luke Wilson, and I'm a researcher at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 to monitor religious freedom conditions abroad and make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. Thank you for joining us this morning for this discussion on religious freedom for Indigenous communities in Latin America. Despite increased international attention to the religious freedom concerns of Indigenous communities and individuals, discrimination, violent attacks, threats, and land seizures persist. In Mexico, drug traffickers have murdered religious leaders working to protect Indigenous communities. Within Indigenous communities, those who convert to a religion or belief different from that practiced by the majority may be subject to fines, imprisonment, or violence. And throughout the region, extractive companies cause serious damage to sacred natural sites. USCIRF's recent report on the topic provides a timeline of major recent religious freedom violations committed against Indigenous peoples in the region, documents the international mechanisms aimed at the protection of Indigenous peoples' religious freedom, and analyzes domestic legal measures related to the protection of Indigenous peoples' right to freedom of religion or belief. To help guide this morning's conversation, I'm joined by USCIRF Commissioners Mohamed Magid and Frank Wolf. I am also pleased to be joined by two of the authors of the report, Teresa Flores and Dennis Petri. I will now turn the floor over to Commissioner Magid to share his thoughts. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Luke. And I am also like to thank our guest speakers for joining us this morning to share the findings of the report. I would like to start by highlighting a few reasons why we need to increase our attention to the right of freedom of religion or belief for Indigenous people in Latin America. First, the right to religious freedom for Latin Americans, Indigenous people, is often overlooked because of the holistic nature of their worldview. As well as we all know, international human rights laws protections for the right to freedom of religion or belief are universal. All individuals have the freedom to adhere to any religion or belief or none. However, many Indigenous people share worldview that integrates spiritual practices, land, culture, identity, and self-government and autonomy. Now, some of these areas are not always perceived to be related to freedom of religion or belief. But protecting these areas is essential for Indigenous communities to exercise their right. Indigenous spiritual practices are from religious expressions. Indigenous land is often viewed as a sacred or as religious sanctuary. Indigenous culture is not separable from the religion, connected and linked to the religion. And the Indigenous self-government is a vehicle for religious expression. A second reason to increase our attention is because Indigenous people face unique and external and internal challenges to this right. Some Latin Americans, Indigenous communities remain practically, vulnerable to religious freedom violation. Particularly vulnerable to religious freedom violation by external sources such as government and non-state actors. This violation include government confiscating Indigenous property used for spiritual purposes and prohibiting Indigenous people from entering their sacred spaces. They also include drug trafficking, gangs, and armed guerrillas, forcibly preventing Indigenous people from moving freely in their own territories. Such restrictions compromise the integrity of Indigenous people relationship with the nature as living temple in their worldview. Meanwhile, Latin American Indigenous people also face internal threats to their religious freedom or threats coming from within their own community. For example, some individuals who convert from indigenous worldview to another religion, such as Christianity, are punished by their community leaders for attending places of worship close to their territories. Punishments have include fines, imprisonment, and physical labor. Lastly, we should also pay better attention to how well the legal instrument endorsed by United Nations and an Organization of American States are enforced to protect indigenous people religious freedom. I look forward to the discussions, and I will now pass the floor to the highly respected, well-known Commissioner Wolf.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Magid. I appreciate it. And I want to welcome again to our guest speakers and to everyone in our audience. I am very pleased to see such great interest in this topic. I will offer a few thoughts on the broad trends USCIRF has identified regarding religious freedom for Indigenous people. These trends also underscore why this USCIRF report is so very, very important. First, USCIRF has found that publicly available information on how well the right to freedom of religion or belief is protected for indigenous populations in Latin America is limited. According to data compiled by the Congressional Research Service, the indigenous population in this region has less access to the internet and a higher poverty rate than non-indigenous populations. In addition, indigenous populations are extraordinarily linguistically and culturally diverse and are more likely to live in isolated rural areas than non-indigenous populations. This combination of factors has made assessing religious freedom conditions for Latin American indigenous population particularly challenging. That's why this report is so important. When USCIRF does identify publicly available information on religious freedom violations, that information often shows that an array of actors commit violations against indigenous peoples, including actors not typically associated with freedom of religion or belief issues. For example, extractive companies like oil companies and others engage in excessive mining and logging activities that destroy sacred indigenous natural sites or prevents access to them. Reports also indicate that illegal extractive enterprises commit acts of violence against indigenous communities, such as property destruction and sexual abuse, to force them from their spiritually significant territory. The report that Teresa and Dennis authored overcomes the challenges posed by limited information and highlights how, sadly, indigenous peoples in Latin America experience a wide range of religious freedom violations from a variety of actors. Before concluding, I'd like to note that religious freedom conditions for indigenous communities, though historically overlooked, has begun to receive increased attention. Just last year, the former Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of religion or belief released a report surveying the topic. As USCIRF, we applaud this development, and we will continue to monitor and report on religious freedom for indigenous communities. In this regard, I hope today's conversation will help draw more attention to the plight faced by indigenous communities seeking to freely practice their religion or belief. Back to you, Luke, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioners Magid and Wolf. As I mentioned before, we are joined today by report authors Teresa Flores and Dennis Petri. Teresa currently serves as the director of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. Dennis currently serves as the international director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom and is the founder of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. In researching this report, Teresa, Dennis, and their team used a mixed methods data collection approach combining semi-structured interviews, desk research, and the violent incidents database of the Observatory of Religious Freedom in Latin America. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Wolf, Commissioner Magid, to all the USCIRF team, of course, for making this possible. And thank you also to the audience for your interest in this topic. It is truly a wonderful opportunity to be part of this conversation, and especially to discuss such a relevant and at the same time so overlooked topic, the religious freedom for indigenous communities in Latin America. So an important aspect that this research sought to cover was the international and Latin American regulatory framework behind the religious freedom of indigenous communities, and whether this right was being recognized and warranted or not. So among the international legal instruments that broadly protect human rights and under which the protection of the right to religious freedom of indigenous peoples could be included, we can mention the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the American Convention on Human Rights. But if we want to mention more specific regulations, it is essential to consider, for instance, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, which states that in the application of the provisions of the convention, the spiritual, social, and cultural values and practices of indigenous peoples must be recognized and protected. Other instruments, such as the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, develops with more or less detail that indigenous communities have the right to manifest, have the right to practice, to develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions. They also mention the right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites. Also, the right to use and control their ceremonial objects, and the right to the repatriation of their human remains. On the regional level, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples assert that indigenous communities have collective rights that are indispensable for their existence, one of them being the right to profess and practice their spiritual beliefs. And the term indigenous spirituality is used, and it is noted that indigenous peoples have the right to freely exercise their own spirituality and beliefs. This declaration also states that no indigenous peoples or person shall be subject to pressures or impositions or any other type of coercive measures that limit their right to freely exercise their beliefs. And of course, urges that states adopt mechanisms to promote respect for indigenous spirituality in accordance with international law. Another relevant aspect that we found is that at the regional level, the Inter-American System on Human Rights has case law regarding indigenous people's rights. And from the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court, it is inferred that one of the rights protected by Article 12 of the American Convention is that of granting burial to the deceased according to the decedent's own religious belief. And likewise, the impediment to carrying out these funeral rites constitutes a violation of the integrity of the surviving relatives of these indigenous communities. The court also protects indigenous sacred sites under a new interpretation of the right to property. And the court estimates that the spiritual aspects of indigenous beliefs are also protected by the right to cultural identity. So with this short overview, we can affirm that indigenous communities or indigenous people's beliefs are internationally considered worthy of legal protection, and that states are compelled to implement mechanisms to put this range of protection into practice. And one of the first mandates for these signatory countries of the different international instruments, it is usually adapting their domestic legal orders to comply with its international obligations. So among the most relevant findings, we can mention that the countries that did not ratify the ILO's Convention 169 are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Panama, and Uruguay. And in this context, except for Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Uruguay, all domestic legal frameworks in Latin America recognize the existence of indigenous communities in their territories. Only a handful of constitutions in the region, in Latin America, refer to the religious beliefs or religious practices of indigenous peoples. We can mention the Constitution of Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, or Venezuela. And at the same time, most countries have included the recognition and protection of the religious beliefs of indigenous peoples in other legal provisions. So in addition, some countries have given due consideration to the recognition of the worldview and spiritual practices communities through case law. Also, another interesting conclusion was that the territory is the base of the cultural identity and spiritual well-being. So the loss of their ancestral lands and territories might therefore threaten the indigenous people's very survival as a collective. And some constitutions explicitly recognize and protect the right of indigenous communities to their lands. We can mention Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Guatemala, or Mexico. Another conclusion was that the belief system of indigenous peoples, understood broadly, can be sometimes included within the scope of the protection of their culture and cultural identity, which is considered essential in the protection of indigenous rights. And there are legal regulations pertaining to various fields, education, health, environment, etc., that also safeguard the worldview of indigenous peoples based on the protection of their culture. And finally, another aspect to consider when reviewing the regulatory framework is the link between self-government and religious freedom. So this is essential for the assessment of the protection of these rights, both collectively and individually, because the spiritual beliefs of indigenous peoples include specific practices, and any kind of failure to comply with them might give rise to sanctioning procedures approved or allowed under the indigenous community uses and customs. So for the sake of time, I'm going to stop here, but I hope to be able to expand on some of the topics at the time of the questions. Back to you, Luke. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. I would now like to pass the floor over to Dennis for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you also to the commissioners and the USCIRF staff, and also greet the audience. So as was just explained, there is a strong framework in international and inter-American law that guarantees the protection of the religious freedom of indigenous communities. And these supranational instruments have largely been implemented in the domestic legislation of most Latin American states. However, in our report, we found substantial evidence of a contrast between national and international legal norms and the reality on the ground. Now, before I explore this evidence, I want to emphasize an essential analytical distinction. Threats to the religious freedom of indigenous communities can be external or internal. External threats impact the collective dimension, while internal threats affect individual aspects of religious freedom. Our examination has identified 5 primary concerns regarding violations of the collective dimension of religious freedom against indigenous communities. These include issues like the lack of recognition of ancestral land ownership, state absence coupled with organized crime, extraction of natural resources by legal and illegal entities, breakdown of the social fabric, and dispossession through appropriation. Quantifying incidents violating the collective dimension is challenging due to their overlap with other forms of abuse, such as economic, social, or political discrimination. In fact, most indigenous worldviews interpret threats to their territories as direct or indirect assaults on religious freedom. These threats, including land grabbing, environmental damage, the presence of foreign missionaries, or external interference, may not always be reported as religious freedom violations by indigenous groups themselves. Now, moving to the individual dimension, we've identified 5 areas of concern: conversion, contributions to patronal feasts, construction of temples, proselytism and religious education, and renunciation of ancestral practices leading to expulsion from communal property. Over the past 5 years, so that's a period between 2018 and 2022, we've identified a total of 1,045 incidents in Colombia, 927 in Mexico, and 19 in Chile, violating the individual dimension of religious freedom. These violations may be more prevalent due to the extensive self-government rights in Colombia and Mexico, allowing such violations to go unpunished. In Chile, incidents are related to the identity movement of the Mapuche community that has increased its activity in recent years. And these incidents are often perpetrated by ethnic group leaders, with organized crime and revolutionary or paramilitary groups also playing a role. Government officials may also be complicit in discriminating against individuals converting away from the majority religion in indigenous communities. The categorization of missionary activity or proselytism poses an additional challenge. Although, if non-coercive, it is a legitimate expression of the right to religious freedom, members of indigenous communities often perceive it as a threat to the preservation of their culture and spirituality, and therefore construe it as a threat to their religious freedom. States and sometimes indigenous authorities themselves, when they have jurisdiction, have justified bans on proselytism in indigenous communities on this basis. Such bans are intended to protect the religious freedom of the minority indigenous community in the country, but can also violate the religious freedom of the minority within the minority. So those are groups within the indigenous communities that adhere to other non-traditional faiths. Balancing individual and collective dimensions of these rights poses difficulties. Recent studies suggest that restrictions on proselytization are associated with lower levels of civil and political rights in general and higher levels of religious hostility. With this in mind, more attention needs to be given to the empirical implications of proselytization in order to better understand the conditions under which constraining or protecting this right affects other human rights. As with other areas of the rule of law in Latin America, the main challenge is the capacity of states to enforce religious freedom provisions in indigenous communities. While the inter-American human rights system is robust in defending collective religious freedom violations, the individual dimension receives disproportionately less attention. These issues warrant national and international attention, and fortunately, they're starting to receive it. Three major players in the religious freedom field, which are the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, and of course USCIRF, have recently published reports on the situation of freedom of religion or belief in indigenous communities. We actively contributed to these reports, including this very report written for the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which we had the privilege to coordinate. The growing interest in freedom of religion or belief in indigenous communities is timely and essential. For years, this issue was ignored despite warnings from grassroots faith organizations and indigenous interest groups. Lack of reliable information and an insufficient conceptualization of these complex violations contributed to this oversight. Today, we appreciate USCIRF's commitment to raising awareness and understanding this crucial dimension of religious freedom. Well, thank you very much, and back to you, Luke.
Thank you, Teresa and Dennis. That was a very helpful and comprehensive overview of USCIRF's new report. Before I begin with a couple of questions, I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit your own questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We'll kick off with this question. Teresa and Dennis, as we dive into our discussion, perhaps we can begin by learning more about some of the basic demographic information regarding indigenous populations in Latin America. Which countries in Latin America tend to have high populations of indigenous peoples? What religions or beliefs are prevalent among indigenous communities? And what are some of their typical governance structures?
Okay, well, so in regard with the numbers, so we can only have estimates about data on indigenous people. This kind of information is really hard. It's very difficult to compile because of several factors. For one is the limited recognition of these peoples by authorities. Also is the complexity of self-identification as indigenous, and this is different also in every country. And it is also the lack of official disaggregated data. So it is difficult, but of course, there have been attempts by institutions and by organizations. We can mention the report made from the International Labour Organization. This is a 2019 report, and indicates that in the LA and the Caribbean, there are around 54.8 million indigenous people. And that is around 8.5% of the region's populations. Some years before that, in 2015, the World Bank indicated that the largest indigenous populations are located in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Bolivia, which together represent more than 80% of the regional total. So it is important to understand that we can only have estimates about the demographic information. About the religions that are prevalent, it is important to remember also that these religious beliefs are examples of the syncretism between the spiritual system or the spiritual beliefs that they have with their ancestors and those that they learn after the conquest, after the process of Christian evangelization. So this, of course, includes rituals in sacred places, the use of natural resources, special kinds of prayers, of songs. So in general, all these religious experience is known also as the indigenous worldview. So which is basically a belief system based on a very deep spirituality. Now, we cannot generalize. Each indigenous community has its own indigenous worldview. So it is very particular per indigenous community, and this varies across Latin America. There are some cross-cutting elements. We can mention the sacredness of their land, the belief that all resources, all natural resources are alive and have spiritual significance. So that is one thing to consider. And one of the researchers that we reviewed when doing this report also was Dr. Nuria Reward, and what she mentions is really interesting, and is that the indigenous peoples, indigenous communities, they do not have a dividing line between religion and the rest of their aspects of their lives. It's like everything is interrelated. And that is also something important to consider when we analyze religious freedom of indigenous communities. About the governance structure, it is important to consider also the self-government and self-determination elements, because these allow indigenous community to freely adopt, to freely choose the way they live, their internal governments, their authorities, their rules, etc. So, of course, this also varies according to each indigenous community.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We have an additional question here. We heard in the opening remarks about international and regional human rights laws protections for indigenous peoples' religious freedom. How well have these protections been incorporated in domestic law in Latin American countries? And are there countries you would highlight as particularly effective or ineffective at incorporating these kinds of religious freedom protections into their legal frameworks?
Okay, so about the incorporation, if we consider the incorporation only at the legal level or in the context of the legal aspect, Latin America has made a great job. Actually, most of the Latin American countries have incorporated, especially since the signing of the ILS Convention, they have modified regulations, they have adopted laws that recognize basic rights for indigenous peoples. We can name self-determination, prior consultation, political participation, and of course the protection of their sacred land. So this is something that Latin American countries have done. But the situation with religious freedom is particular because the worldview, the rituals or religion as such is included only as a constitutive element only in some constitutions. And I mentioned before the constitution of Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, or Venezuela. But if we review other legal provisions, we can also find regulations that at the end impact somehow or influence somehow multiple dimensions of the religious freedom of indigenous community. For instance, in Brazil, it is considered a crime against the Indians and the indigenous culture to mock indigenous ceremonies, rites, uses, customs, etc. In Venezuela, religious institutions that act or intend to act in indigenous peoples and community, they need to comply with, inform, and consult to the indigenous communities or the authorities. So we need to review the whole legal framework, not just the constitution, but other legal provisions, because at least at the legal level, there are provisions. If these provisions are met in practice, that is another issue.
Thank you so much, Teresa, once again. And at this point, I'd like to invite Commissioners Magid and Wolf in case they have any reflections or questions they would like to ask to the panelists.
I'd like to just raise one issue. many of these areas that the indigenous populations are in are very, very remote. Do most of them vote? And do they have representation in the various parliaments or governments?
Can I answer that question? Yes, thank you. Yes, so most of them vote, yes, indeed. It's actually amazing to see how much civic culture there is among indigenous communities. So they generally go out and vote. And in some countries have really managed in recent years, but it's fairly recent, to get a representative elected from within their own communities, especially in Bolivia. But it's not the case in all countries where the party system is relatively restrictive, and it's not very easy for new parties to emerge to represent indigenous communities. So the situation is varied, but indigenous communities do vote, and yes, in some countries they do have clear access to representation, but it's not the case across the board. Now, one thing also, now that you mention the issue of the remoteness of the indigenous communities, that's part of the reason why the enforcement of the right to religious freedom in indigenous communities, and more broadly human rights in general, is so challenging for indigenous communities, right? It's very often a combination of a lack of political will, but because of the remoteness, also of a state capacity to enforce human rights, including religious rights in indigenous communities. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to also highlight that aspect.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is about regulations. How those companies or the gangs and group that come and raid those land or confiscate the land, what legal remedy do they have? What are the things in place that those indigenous can seek to restore justice?
I can try to answer that. Actually, as I mentioned, Latin American countries have done very well adapting their legal frameworks. Of course, not all of them, and not at the same level, but there are provisions that protect indigenous communities. The problem is that these provisions are not really put in practice. It is very, very difficult for indigenous communities to for them to that the authorities respects, for instance, the prior consultation in cases of the exploitation of natural resources. Many of them suffer because their territories are not being limited for them, or because there is an economical model that also exploits natural resources, and they do not address indigenous communities issues or the impact that this might have with indigenous communities. So the issue is not so much about the remedies that they might have, but that in practice, these remedies that might be fines, it might be maybe to close the company or activities, etc. It's not put into practice because there are economic interests behind. And unfortunately, that is more important in some cases than the well-being of the indigenous peoples.
May I just add a couple of thoughts about this question? I think it's very important. As Teresa mentioned, the legal frameworks require prior consultation of indigenous communities if anything is going to happen on their land. The problem very often is, or one of the problems is, that there are issues with the legal titles of the indigenous lands, right? And so because those property rights are not respected, the requirement for prior consultation can easily be skipped, right? So that's also an issue. And then there's a conceptual issue, I would say, and that is that those raids on indigenous lands are often not interpreted, not understood as religious freedom violations, right? They may be interpreted as environmental damage or something of the like, but not as religious freedom violations, which they are if you take the holistic indigenous worldview as a starting point. And so the conceptual matter is also one that I think policymakers need to address.
Thank you so much for those very helpful exchanges. We have an additional question here. What can civil society in Latin America do to help shine a light on Indigenous freedom of religion or belief challenges? And what additional work is necessary at the community, national, and international level that states cannot do or have no political will to do? So I'll throw that to Teresa and Dennis, perhaps.
Yes, so those are really two questions in one, the answer by civil society and the answer by policymakers, right? And that's more the realm of policy recommendations. I would say that in both cases, it's just very important to understand the multidimensional nature of religious freedom, in particular, considering the holistic worldviews of most indigenous communities, but also this distinction that I made in my introductory remarks between internal threats and external threats to the religious freedom of indigenous communities. I think that is just essential to be aware of that. And then taking that as a starting point, what civil society can do is really contribute to incident documentation. We at the institutions we work for have this data collection instrument called the Violent Incidents Database, where we record as many incidents as possible based on public resources. But I think much more can be done to really bring to light all the violations, and we really need all the support we can get from civil society to contribute to that documentation. Civil society very often is very good at raising awareness and performing humanitarian work, participating in training initiatives, etc. But I think incident documentation is something civil society should do more, especially when the state is absent. And once incidents are documented, of course, states need to take responsibility, but they cannot take responsibility if something has not been documented, right? It is as if it did not happen. That's why incident documentation is just so important. So yeah, that's what I would say. And regarding the recommendations for policymakers, I think we should really come back to this notion that decision makers should broaden their understanding of the religious freedom of indigenous communities. Again, I insist in this on this multidimensional perspective. The religious freedom of individuals is strongly linked to the idea of community and union with the land, unity of the land. And for this reason, it is really recommended that decision makers require companies, whether US companies or any national or companies investing in Latin America, to comply with human rights and environmental protection standards, and including the participation and due consultation with indigenous communities before and during the implementation of the projects, to be mindful of the religious sensibilities of what they would be doing.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was a really helpful exchange. We have one additional question here. How is the tension between community rights to culture and traditional religion balanced with the rights of individuals to convert to other religions, should they so choose? And it's a two-part question again. Where does the invitation to consider new faiths cross over into inappropriate and coercive proselytizing?
Well, this comes back to this distinction between external and the external threats to religious freedom and the internal threats to religious freedom. And I really spent some time in my remarks on the issue of proselytism, which is on the one hand an expression of the right to religious freedom from the internal perspective, right? But at the same time is very often viewed or construed as a violation of religious freedom from the external perspective. The problem with missionary activity is that it happens on indigenous lands. And since it happens on indigenous lands, and those lands are considered as sacred, as the temple for traditional indigenous communities, it's basically violating the freedom of worship of those indigenous communities from a collective perspective. But at the same time, it's also an individual right. So there's no easy answer, no solution to this. I think it's very important to be mindful of the of these tensions, and really try to identify the conditions under which particular dimensions of religious freedom, in this case proselytism, may be constrained or not. But it's definitely challenging, and it's actually also part of a broader challenge that exists in international law, in international human rights law, between the first generation human rights, the civil and political rights, and the what we call the third generation rights, right? The collective rights. So that tension is present and is not easily solved, but there doesn't need to be a tension necessarily if, and this would be mainly a call to all the people that engage with indigenous communities to be wise, to be conscious, to be prudent, and the same is also true for the indigenous communities themselves, to act in ways that are as tolerant as possible, instead of being radical and uncompromising. Right? That's of course what I would say, but that's never easy. That tension is real. We need to understand it. But it's important that we're talking about this right now. I think it contributes to our understanding, and that's an important first step.
Look, I just want to add something. I think that for civil society organizations and even authorities, it is more common to advocate for these uses and customs, or for the self-determination, the autonomy of indigenous peoples. And this is a way of recognizing and protect them. And that's fine. That is necessary, actually. But it is also important to determine to what extent this self-government, this self-determination effectively safeguard the worldview of the group without jeopardizing the individual religion freedom of its inhabitants.
Thank you very much, Dennis and Teresa. We have another question here. How do you recommend U.S. policymakers approach concerns about indigenous freedom of religion or belief or spirituality concerns with bilateral partners, especially when there are strong economic interests in forming actions that undermine indigenous communities' religious freedom? For example, land grabs of sacred sites, contamination of resources that impact ancestral spirits.
So religious freedom is not just a human right. Religious freedom is also a theme. And I believe very strongly that it needs to be more and more a cross-cutting theme in public policy, domestic policy, and also foreign policy, including economic diplomacy. That means that policymakers in bilateral conversations, bilateral negotiations, simply need to be mindful of the religious freedom implications of anything that's being discussed, and that, I think, is connected to the need to increase the knowledge, the awareness among policymakers about religious freedom in all its dimensions, and that means that it's also important to move away from having only a Western understanding of religious freedom and an individual understanding of religious freedom. It also has a collective component dimension that's of course very strong in indigenous communities. I know we traditionally use the word Western to refer to Europe and North America, although it's actually a little bit strange when you consider it geographically, right? Because Latin America is actually also a Western region geographically, right? It's a Western hemisphere, at least west from the Middle East and the East, right? So the term Western and non-Western may be a little bit confusing, but I think you get what I mean. So it's a matter really of religious freedom literacy and of considering religious freedom as a cross-cutting axis in economic diplomacy in this case. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that answer. Dennis, in your remarks, you mentioned that you and your colleagues have identified thousands of religious freedom violations against Indigenous individuals in Latin America. What kinds of violations do you find to be the most common?
Yes. So the most common violations in terms of the massive impact include forced displacement due to harassment by criminal organizations or illegal miners, and also the destruction of natural resources due to massive extraction, the destruction of sacred places, and nature itself, which is viewed as necessary for the religious practice of indigenous communities. So that's considering the collective or external dimension of religious freedom. At the individual level, the most common violation is expulsion from the community due to conversion away from traditional religiosity, including harassment through deprivation of essential services, expulsion from the territory, and the use of violence, physical violence, as a corrective measure.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Are there any gaps in international human rights law's protections for Indigenous peoples' right to freedom of religion or belief? And if so, how would you fill those gaps?
Yeah, about the gaps, I think that it is important, and we already mentioned this, I think, it is important to include the issue of religious freedom of individuals within Indigenous communities. This is a problem that is often overlooked, and authorities, even at the national level, they are unaware of this. And I think that there is a responsibility not just from the international community, but especially from the national authorities, because at the end, the agreements at the international level are a result of government's consensus. So if the authority, if the representative of a given country is not aware of what is happening in its own country with Indigenous community, it will be very difficult for them to, put this topic on the agenda. So I think that it's very important to fill this gap, first working at the local level, raising awareness about this problem, about this issue, and then asking authorities to do something about that. And then maybe the international community will do something about that too, take a stand, issue a resolution, maybe a treaty, a declaration, I don't know, something that can include these kind of issues in the public agenda, in international agenda as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Wolf, did you have something you wanted to address?
I did. Thank you very much. I just wanted to throw out an idea for the panelists and also for any of the people watching. It's very difficult to know what's going on unless you go see it and visit and feel it and touch it and taste it and talk to the people. I would encourage the panelists and some of the groups that are listening to put together a proposal to invite a group of members of Congress from both Republican and Democratic side, House and Senate, to come down and see. It's one thing to read a report. It's another thing to kind of hear about it in a newspaper, but I would encourage you, and I know I've been thinking as you've been saying these things, if we bring a group of people down who have the capacity to do something about it, and let them see it for their own eyes, experience it, eat with the people, break bread, go out, travel, see, then they will come back and become passionate to do something about it. So I would urge you, and also some of the panelists, but some of the groups that are watching, to put together a group and next year invite a group of members of Congress to come down and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. That's a very helpful contribution. We have an additional question here. What role do Indigenous land rights and self-governance rights play in Indigenous people's ability to freely exercise their right to religious freedom?
Actually, there is a close relationship. As we have mentioned, territories have a deep significance for Indigenous peoples. So any threat against their sacred lands and the natural resource that are in those sacred lands is considered a direct threat to the life itself of the Indigenous communities, including their spiritual dimension. So, of course, in the way that these sacred lands are not properly protected, is more possible that their religious freedom is being restricted or limited. In the case of self-government, I think that in my remarks, I also mentioned that self-government and self-determination helps Indigenous communities to freely choose the way they live. And this includes their political dimension, economical, social, cultural, and of course, religious dimension. So of course, this includes that they have also specific sanctions if any of these rules are not complied by the Indigenous members. So if this self-government, if this self-determination allow authorities to sanction without due respect to human rights, without not just religious freedom, but all human rights. So then this is a situation that needs to be analyzed in depth. It is, as I said also, it is easier for us to defend these uses and customs, and that is necessary. But we need to balance we need to balance how important it is to preserve this community identity. But if by doing this, we limit the individual rights of their inhabitants, so something is off there, and we need to address that, and we need to analyze this further.
Yes, just to complement, if I may, Luke, the recognition of self-government rights in Indigenous communities is really a correction of historical injustice since colonial times, right? That really disrespected, to put it mildly, the unity of the and the cultures of Indigenous communities, and therefore also their religious rights. And so implementing self-government rights for Indigenous communities is only fair. It's a correction, a historical correction that is absolutely necessary. And the report, I think, makes it very clear that Indigenous communities continue to be under a lot of pressure and suffer many threats. The problem is that at the same time, those self-government rights, as we've also identified, and what Teresa just mentioned, create a situation in which sometimes the individual human rights of the members of Indigenous communities are disregarded. And because it's those communities are self-governed, there is in practice not much the national jurisdiction and international jurisdiction can do about it. So that's really the challenge here. Self-government rights are necessary, important protection, but they need to be balanced with a respect for individual human rights. So that's very important. And I just would like to thank Commissioner Wolf for his a very helpful suggestion that we will definitely give due consideration. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll combine two questions here, and they're about next steps. Besides giving visibility to this issue, how can the international community work together to improve religious freedom for Indigenous peoples? Do you have any specific recommendations you would give to policymakers or to practitioners?
Well, I think I would like to espouse Commissioner Wolf's recommendation to really invite policymakers, members of Congress, to visit Indigenous communities. I think that would really make a lot of a huge difference for because it will raise more awareness about the multiple dimensions of religious freedom violations, and then in addition to that, I think as what we've mentioned before, being more mindful of the collective and individual dimensions of religious freedom, the external and internal threats, is I think essential, and that's I think to be connected with really a strong effort to increase the knowledge of civil servants working in foreign policy about the specific implications for religious freedom in Indigenous communities. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I see that we're quickly approaching the hour mark. So before I close it out, I would just like to throw it out to the panelists here to see if they have any final remarks that they would like to end the meeting on.
I don't think we have any final remarks apart from thanking the commissioners and thanking USCIRF for putting this very important issue on the agenda, for providing us with the opportunity to highlight the research that we've been doing and contribute to the importance of raising awareness about these issues. You see, Latin American countries have nearly perfect legal frameworks, and the religious freedom in Indigenous communities issue actually reveals that there's of course room for improvement, as there always is, but the main problem is in the in terms of enforcement, and there of course there is an important role also for US policymakers, and so I'm very grateful that we can address US policymakers through this platform provided by USCIRF. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to also extend my thanks to Commissioners Mohamed Magid and Frank Wolf for leading today's conversation on religious freedom for Indigenous communities in Latin America. And of course, a big thank you to Dennis and Teresa for authoring this report and for participating in today's discussion. We dropped the link to the report in the chat box, and we hope you will take advantage of this valuable resource. If you would like to learn more about USCIRF's work on religious freedom, including our recommendations for US policy, I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. We look forward to hosting similar conversations in the months ahead on a variety of other topics in countries related to religious freedom. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you next time.